My cheating wife left with her criminal boss, they were both arrested, and I divorced her. It seems like a simple story of betrayal, but reality is always crueler than any imagination. The truth is that it all started silently, almost imperceptibly. Little ignored signs, acceptable excuses, that feeling that something was out of place, but there was no proof, just suspicions. She left work later, smiled differently, checked her phone frequently. I should have noticed, I should have asked more difficult questions, but I got carried away by the justifications. How could I be so naive? The worst thing about cheating is not the immediate pain, but the slow, brutal discovery that everything you believed about your marriage was a lie. For months, I lived without knowing that she was no longer mine, but someone else's. And not anyone else. She was with her boss, a man with power and money, someone who offered her a world I couldn't compete with. But I didn't know, I had no idea how much my life was about to fall apart. It all started with an anonymous call, that dry, almost mocking voice that just said, "Your wife is not who you think she is." Of course, at first I thought it was a prank, someone envious or just a crazy person wanting to cause discord. However, that seed was planted and, as anyone would do, I began to take a closer look. Little things bothered me. An overpriced restaurant bill for lunch, new clothes I'd never seen before, knowing smiles exchanged at social gatherings, and then, one night, she didn't come home. At first, I thought something had happened. I called, texted, and her excuse was always the same, "I'm busy with an important new project at work." I wanted to believe. Days passed, and then weeks. The excuses became more and more convincing, but my distrust only grew. The truth always finds a way of showing itself, of tearing the masks and revealing what's behind. And it was on one of those nights that everything came to a head. Deep down in my being, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize the extent of the problem. My heart would race every time she left for an important meeting, and I would stay at home, suffocating in silence. One day, I was standing in the living room, looking out the window, when 2 police cars arrived, sirens blaring, frantic, as if searching for a dangerous criminal. A woman shouted, "It's her! It's her!" And it was like a punch in the gut. My wife came out in handcuffs, hair disheveled, face pale, as if the world was falling around her. On her side, he, the boss, also in handcuffs. Cold, complicit, but also frightened looks. My body paralyzed, my throat went dry, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of the sirens mixed with the buzzing that came from my own mind trying to process it all. How was that possible? How was the woman I had built a life with being taken away by police officers like a criminal? I remember her turning to me, eyes wide, trying to say something, but nothing came out. At that moment, words didn't matter. What had been said, done, betrayed, was already there, exposed like an open wound. "I can explain," she screamed as she was pushed into the squad car. "Explain? Explain what? That you betrayed me? Who went out with a criminal? Who lied to me all these months?" The following weeks were a blur of painful revelations and bitter disappointments. I went to the police station, and the police officer looked at me with pity before telling me the whole truth. She was up to her neck in her boss's dirty business. Money laundering, fraud, financial crimes that I couldn't even imagine. And to think that I believed her when she said she worked overtime, when she said she needed to travel for work, that her boss was just a professional mentor. Everything was a lie. Her every word was a dagger stuck in my chest, spinning, tearing apart everything I knew to be true. Divorce was inevitable. And the worst of all, she didn't even fight it. He accepted the defeat, the trial, the accusations, as if he knew there was nowhere to run. On the days of visiting the prison, I saw his face through the glass, eyes that once looked at me with love now empty, without shine. The woman I knew was gone, left behind, exchanged for the fleeting glamour of a life of luxury and crime. There were no more words to be said between us. Just silence and the cold certainty that everything we built together was nothing more than a facade, a poorly rehearsed theater that ended tragically. And just when I thought everything had been exposed, that I was finally free to rebuild my life, came the ultimate revelation. Something that made me question everything, including myself. Something that changed the way I saw not only her, but the entire story we had lived. Something that now keeps me up every night, trying to find meaning in the chaos. And that's what this story is about. From the journey of a betrayed man, a broken heart, and the desperate search for answers that may never come. After all, how far will someone go to hide the truth? And, more importantly, how far was I willing to go to discover it? And so, just when everything seems lost, one last piece of the puzzle appears, revealing an even deeper betrayal, a secret that goes beyond crime and infidelity, something that completely transforms the meaning of everything that has happened so far. Something that makes betrayal seem like just the beginning. Welcome to our channel. Here, betrayal is never supported. All of our stories are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal destroys lives, trusts and families. Get ready, because today's story will impact you deeply. Adjust the volume, take a deep breath, and prepare for a shocking plot full of twists and turns. Good story. Mark has always been the type of man who valued stability and commitment. Hardworking, focused, with a solid career as a financial consultant at a renowned firm, he lived in search of building a secure future with the woman he loved, Sarah. They lived in an elegant apartment on Manhattan's Upper East Side, surrounded by comforts that took years to achieve. For many, they were the perfect couple, young, beautiful and successful. Mark was 36 years old, self-assured, strong and practical. Sarah, 34, was smart, independent and knew how to charm everyone with her smile. Wherever they went, they were seen as the representation of a perfect life. And for a long time, that's exactly how Mark felt. Mark and Sarah met during a corporate event. He, newly promoted at his company, was looking for professional connections. She, a talented lawyer on the rise, knew how to attract attention. And that's exactly what he did. Her eyes sparkled at him that night, and he felt captured. The beginning was intense, full of expensive dinners, impulsive trips, and boundless passion. And, within a few months, the relationship was consolidated in a way that seemed unbeatable. They were married before long, and Sarah, who had always dreamed of being part of an active social life, seemed to have finally found the balance between hard work and the glamour of being the wife of a prosperous businessman. Marriage brought not only unity but also challenges. Sarah had a busy routine as a lawyer at a renowned law firm, dealing with important and often arrogant clients. She worked late nights, took calls at all hours of the day, and often had to attend networking events. Mark admired his wife's effort and ambition, but this also meant that he often felt like a mere spectator of his own life, waiting for some time with her that didn't always happen. He tried to balance his own career with Sarah's, but her success was growing almost by leaps and bounds. While Mark was looking for more security and stability, Sarah longed for novelty, excitement, something that would add flavor to the hectic routine she was living. This was a blind spot in their relationship, something that was never properly addressed, just pushed aside under a false veneer of normalcy. Their lives seemed like a sequence of perfect days. Nights filled with expensive wine, dinners in sophisticated restaurants, mutual friends constantly praising how lucky they were to have each other. But somehow, Mark felt a certain uneasiness growing. He couldn't identify where it was coming from, but he had the impression that Sarah was moving away. Her absence felt heavier, her smiles more forced. In the moments they were together, she was physically present, but her mind always seemed to fly elsewhere, as if something important was being kept secret. When I asked her if something was wrong, she just shook her head and smiled. Just work, love. Everything is fine. And he wanted to believe. I needed to believe. After all, to love is to trust, and that's exactly what he did. Sarah, on the other hand, felt trapped. Not to her husband, but to the idea that her life should follow an established pattern: the perfect career, the impeccable marriage, the dream apartment. There were days when she would look out her office window and wonder if this was really the life she wanted for herself. She felt that her professional success was insufficient, that she needed something more, something that would make her feel alive again. Her boss, Donovan, noticed this uneasiness. He was the kind of man who knew an opportunity when he saw one, and Sarah became just that, an opportunity. Owner of a strong presence, a self-confidence that bordered on excess, Donovan was the opposite of Mark. He was not looking for stability, but rather power and influence. Over the months, he got closer to Sarah, offering advice and mentoring that went beyond the professional. Together, they spent hours discussing cases, business strategies, even Sarah's most private dreams. Mark didn't know this, of course. He only saw Donovan as his wife's demanding boss, someone who certainly recognized her worth and talent. And for Mark, Sarah's talent was a source of pride. He was proud of her independence, the way she gained space in such a competitive environment. However, this also meant less time for the couple, fewer quiet nights watching movies on the couch, fewer conversations about future plans. Even so, Mark tried hard to keep the marriage in balance, making up for her absences with special dinners, weekend trips, and always trying to show unconditional support. For him, keeping the relationship alive was a priority, and he dedicated himself to it as an investment in his future happiness. But the more Mark tried to get closer, the further away Sarah seemed to become. "You've been so different lately," he commented one night, as they were having dinner at an Italian restaurant, one of her favorites. Sarah looked away and sighed, as if his comment were a weight. "It's just work, Mark. It's a complicated phase, I'm under pressure." You know how it is, and he knew. He understood what it was like to be under pressure, but he had never known that pressure could push them away like this. He reached across the table, trying to reach her hand, trying to find something familiar in her touch. But Sarah just smiled vaguely and pulled her hand back, pretending to look for something in her bag. Mark felt a tightness in his chest, but he forced himself to believe that this was just a phase, that everything would soon return to normal. But something inside him said that maybe normal would never be the same again. The silence between them grew, but Mark refused to let it affect their lives. He planned a future for both of them, believing that everything was going as it should, that the sacrifices were worth it. Even when Sarah arrived late at night, exhausted and distracted, he welcomed her warmly, prepared a quick dinner and tried to forget the feeling that she was moving further and further away. What he didn't know was that there was a world of secrets hidden beneath the surface. Sarah was increasingly involved with Donovan, not just in the company's cases, but in something bigger, something that Mark couldn't even imagine. While Mark saw Donovan as just an ambitious boss, Sarah saw someone who filled a void of emotion and adrenaline that she believed she had lost. And so, night after night, the two followed their routines, he trying to save what he saw as a perfect marriage, she looking for something that would give her back the feeling of living intensely. Little did Mark know that Sarah's search was about to lead them all down a path of no return, where nothing would be the same as before and where he, the devoted and faithful husband, would be the last person to understand what was happening. And what seemed like just a marriage with communication problems would soon become something much bigger, something that would involve betrayal, crime and, inevitably, a truth that would destroy all the certainties Mark had about the woman he loved and the life he believed in. Have built. The days turned into weeks, and the feeling of emptiness continued to grow in Mark's chest. He couldn't understand what was wrong, but the distance between him and Sarah was evident. She always seemed to be somewhere else, even when they were in the same room. In a desperate attempt to rescue their marriage, Mark invited her on a weekend trip, just the two of them, away from the worries of work. Sarah, however, refused. "Baby, you know now is not a good time," she said in a calm but distant voice as she packed her bag for yet another business meeting. "I'm swamped with things to do. Maybe in a few weeks." Maybe echoed in Mark's mind, and he felt more and more lost. Mark began throwing himself into his work, filling the empty time with meetings and projects. But even there, in the office, the shadow of doubt haunted him. Sarah's constant absence, the awkward silence during dinners, the way she shut down when he tried to talk. It felt like everything around was slowly sinking into a swamp of uncertainty. One night, returning from the office early, he arrived home hoping to surprise her. He had prepared a candlelit dinner, her favorite dish, but she never showed up. He called and texted, but all he got was a curt reply, "In the office, I'm staying late. Don't wait up for me." It was then that a dangerous idea began to form in Mark's head. He began to wonder if she was really in the office, if those meetings were really about work. He hated the fact that he was thinking that he doubted the woman with whom he had shared years of life. But insecurity grew like a flame fed by the wind, uncontrollable. To his own dismay, he decided to check. He didn't want to feel paranoid, but he needed answers. The following week, after Sarah left for another important meeting, Mark went to the office where she worked. I knew Donovan would be there too, after all, he always was. But what he saw when he arrived was what began to change his life forever. The office lights were off. No staff cars parked, not even Sarah's. Strange. Very strange. Mark's heart was pounding, his hands were sweating. Try as he might, he couldn't convince himself that this was normal. What if there was something more? What if he was right to be suspicious? That's when he saw, in the distance, Sarah get into a car that he had never seen before. It wasn't hers, not a taxi, not an office vehicle. It was an expensive car, the kind that only very important people drive. And, behind the wheel, Donovan. Mark couldn't take his eyes off that scene. It was like watching a movie where the defenseless protagonist watches everything fall apart. He saw the two of them look at each other, laugh, and then she approached him to kiss him. A long, intimate kiss. And at that moment, the ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. The pain was unbearable, like a cold blade piercing his chest. His hands were shaking, and for a moment he felt like he could just run over there, open the car door, and demand answers. But he stood there, shocked, trying to understand how it all happened. It was a betrayal that went beyond the physical, beyond the romance. It was a betrayal of trust, of everything he thought he had with Sarah. They stayed there for a moment, her smiling, his boss touching her face intimately, before the car drove off to somewhere Mark didn't even want to know about. The ride home was a blur. He drove through the streets as if in a trance, his heart sinking, his mind spinning in a jumble of images and thoughts. He remembered the nights he waited for her, the plans they made together, the marriage that seemed perfect to everyone else. Now he knew none of that mattered. It had all been a lie, a well-crafted farce that left him looking like a fool, waiting for a wife who was no longer there for him. But the revelation of the betrayal was not the end, just the beginning of something even darker. That night, Mark lay awake, trying to figure out what he would do next. He thought about confronting her immediately, asking questions, demanding explanations. But something inside him stopped him. I needed more, I needed to know how far this went, how far she was involved. He couldn't make decisions blindly, not yet. Pain burned in his chest like fire, but he knew he needed to maintain control. At least for a while longer. The next day brought the worst part, pretending nothing had changed. Sarah arrived home late, as usual, with the distant smile of someone who has something to hide. She threw herself on the couch, saying she was exhausted, and Mark just nodded, holding back the anger that was boiling inside. He wanted to scream, to confront her, but he knew it wasn't time yet. He couldn't just accuse her without knowing the full truth. And then, the worst came. Mark started putting the pieces together, looking at all the nights she was out late, all the last-minute work trips. Everything started to fall into place. Every apology, every cold hug, every time she looked away. It was all so obvious now, and yet he felt like a blind man who could finally see. And at the same time, he knew that Sarah's betrayal wasn't just a matter of romance. There was something more, something he needed to discover before taking any action. It was hard to believe that the woman he loved so much could betray him like this, but the image of her kissing another man was stuck in his mind. And now, he needed to know. Knowing what was really happening. Knowing how far that betrayal had sunk him. And discover, after all, what would be the next step to put an end to a story he never thought he would live. But he still had no idea what was coming. The following days were a mixture of silent tension and frayed nerves. Mark continued to pretend that nothing had changed, while inside he was destroyed. He followed Sarah's every move, every word spoken and every lie told. It was not easy to maintain the appearance of a calm and carefree husband, but he knew that the full truth still needed to be discovered before he acted. It was like watching a dark movie unfold, where he was trapped as the protagonist with no choice. It was during one of these nights, while Sarah was sleeping soundly beside him, that Mark decided to take action. He took her phone, aware that he was violating a privacy that, in reality, had already been completely broken. His hands shook as he scrolled through his cell phone screen, looking for messages, for calls, for any clue that could clarify where this betrayal went. And then he found it, a series of recently deleted conversations, hidden photos and, worst of all, secret messages exchanged between Sarah and Donovan, exchanged on apps little known to him. The words were raw, direct, full of intimacy in a plan that, until then, Mark did not understand. But one thing was clear, there was something big happening. Something that went beyond physical betrayal, something that involved business, money, and a conspiracy that left him even more stunned. The next day, Mark decided to investigate on his own. He followed Sarah again, this time more attentive to the places she went. He watched her enter a luxurious hotel, in a part of the city he didn't frequent. And then, something caught his attention. She was accompanied by Donovan, as expected, but they were not alone. Other men were present, men who looked more like bodyguards than co-workers. The scene was strange, and Mark's intuition screamed that something was very wrong. He waited for her to leave the hotel and, upon returning home that night, confronted her for the first time. "Where have you been today?" The question was simple, but his tone made it clear that it wasn't simple curiosity. Sarah hesitated for a second, her eyes wandering around the room before answering, "In the office." "I told you, the pressure is mounting." She smiled nervously, but Mark knew that smile was fake. He knew exactly where she had been, and for once, he wasn't willing to accept any more lies. "I know where you've been, Sarah," he snapped, voice full of pain and suppressed anger. "I saw you going into that hotel with Donovan." Her boss's name sounded like poison in Mark's mouth. Sarah froze. The smile disappeared, and her face turned pale as wax. "Mark. It's not what you think." She began, but he didn't want to hear any more excuses. With every word she said, he felt more betrayed, more hurt. "I saw you. I saw it with my own eyes. You lied to me, you deceived me, and I want to know now. Why?" He expected an apology, expected her to admit her betrayal, to cry and beg for forgiveness. But what came was a heavy, suffocating silence. Sarah lowered her head, taking a deep breath, as if trying to find the right words to say. "It's more complicated than you think." She looked like she was about to break down, but then, as if finding strength from some dark place, she lifted her face and looked at him with a serious expression. "You don't know what you're talking about, Mark. You have no idea what's going on." His heart was pounding in his chest, and her words only increased his anger. "Then explain to me. Tell me the truth. I'm tired of being deceived, tired of being made a fool of." It was at that moment that Sarah's mask began to fall. She walked away from him, walked around the room as if looking for a way out of the situation. "You don't understand, Mark. I had no choice." Her eyes were full of tears, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of fear. Donovan, he got me involved in something I couldn't escape. The confession was so raw, so out of context, that Mark needed a few seconds to process what she had said. What do you mean, involved? What does that mean, Sarah? She shook her head, as if trying to deny reality itself. And then the truth came out. Sarah said that months earlier, Donovan had put her in an impossible situation. He discovered an old secret about her past, something she had hidden even from Mark, and threatened her. At first, they were small favors, financial manipulation of company documents, forging signatures. He knew that I had privileged access to certain information, that I was trustworthy. And I needed to keep my job, Mark. I needed to keep working. She said it as if she justified her actions, as if Mark could understand. But he couldn't. To him, it all sounded like a flimsy excuse, a desperate attempt to free himself from guilt. Did you help him commit crimes, Sarah? Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he asked the question. He wanted to believe it was just a hoax, that she was just making up stories to protect herself. But deep down, he knew it was true. And Sarah, defeated, confirmed with a silent nod. I didn't want to. I was forced. You don't understand what he's like. The power he has. Anger burned inside Mark like an uncontrollable flame. Are you saying that your affair with him was because of this? Because of those threats? He hoped the answer was yes, that she could at least use that as a reason for what she did. But the truth was crueler. No, it was about me. I wanted that. I wanted to get out of the routine, I wanted to live something different. The revelation was like a punch in the gut. He felt the ground open beneath his feet. Mark turned, trying to get away from her, trying to find some air to breathe. You destroyed everything, Sarah. You destroyed our marriage. And why? For a man who is just using you. Her look was a mixture of guilt and despair, and the words came out before she could stop them. I know. I know I made a mistake, that I went too far. But I'm trying to work things out. Her voice broke, and then she fell silent, tears streaming freely down her face. And then, as if her words had summoned destruction itself, the doorbell rang. Mark wasn't expecting anyone, and Sarah flinched, as if she already knew what was about to happen. When Mark opened the door, he was greeted by two serious, rigid FBI agents, and the moment that followed was a blur. Questions were asked, documents were presented, and Mark's record fell in one fell swoop. His wife was being taken. Sarah Henson, you are under arrest for involvement in criminal activity, including financial fraud and money laundering. Mark's eyes turned to her, and all he saw was panic. Mark, please listen to me. She tried to reach him, but the agents held her back. I didn't want to involve you. I tried to protect you. But Mark couldn't hear anything else. He was numb, his mind spinning amidst the confusion of feelings. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, was being handcuffed before his eyes. And he stood there, standing, watching everything, powerless to change what was happening. As Sarah was taken away, Mark tried to process everything. The physical betrayal was something he was beginning to understand, but the crime, the involvement with the boss, the conspiracy. That was something he never imagined facing. And yet, here he was, alone, in a room that now seemed empty, with her words echoing in his mind, I tried to protect you. But Mark knew that Sarah's protection had always been a lie. And he still needed to discover the full extent of this lie. And with that came the terrible certainty that the betrayal, the prison and the lies were not the end, but only the beginning of an even crueler truth. Mark stood still for a long moment after Sarah's arrest, trying to process what had just happened. The apartment was plunged into suffocating silence, every corner feeling emptier than ever. The air felt heavy, as if each breath was an effort. The FBI agent's words echoed in his mind, financial fraud, money laundering, criminal involvement. Each term felt like a knife stuck in his memories. Sarah, the woman he loved so much, was now a criminal, and he was the betrayed husband, left to pick up the pieces. The following days were a blur of unanswered questions. Mark felt alone, as if suddenly the world he knew had fallen apart. The police asked constant questions, and he had to give a statement more than once. He was treated as a witness, but the truth is that he knew very little, or nothing, about Sarah's involvement with Donovan and his criminal schemes. However, every question carried weight, and every pitying look from the agents made him feel guilty, as if he had colluded in something he had no idea about. He wavered between anger and guilt, unable to decide if he hated Sarah for everything she did or if he had somehow failed as a husband by not seeing the signs. How could he be so blind? The media quickly picked up the story. The newspapers spoke of the case as a major financial scandal. It was impossible to go out on the streets without seeing Sarah's image on the cover or on the news screen. "Lawyer involved in billion-dollar fraud arrested," read one headline. Mark became the betrayed husband, the target of compassion as well as derision by those who saw his naivety as weakness. This only increased the pressure on him, making him feel suffocated in his own home. Every call from a friend or family member was a constant reminder of his new reality, a reality he didn't ask for and was now forced to face. In the midst of all the chaos, Mark had to make difficult decisions. Lawyers were involved for the divorce, and the process went faster than he expected. Sarah had no choice but to accept the conditions, as she was trapped and completely discredited. For Mark, divorce was a necessity. He could no longer be stuck with a woman who betrayed him so deeply, and not just in a personal way. Her betrayal went beyond marriage. She betrayed his trust, his security, the life he believed he had built. But despite that, there was something that still haunted him, the last sentence Sarah said before being taken away. "I tried to protect you." Protect from what? Protect how? The questions haunted him night and day. He needed answers, even if he knew those answers could destroy him even more. And so, reluctantly and painfully, he decided to visit Sarah in prison. The decision to go there was not easy. The anger he felt towards her still burned, but the need to understand what really happened was greater. It was as if, by finding these answers, he could finally close this chapter of his life. When he found her, Sarah was unrecognizable. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, as if all the light that once existed had gone out. She looked at him with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Perhaps, at that moment, she realized that there was still someone willing to listen, someone who, despite everything, needed to understand. "Mark. I know you hate me. I know there are no excuses for what I did. But I need you to understand." Her voice was a whisper, as if each word was drawn from a deep, dark place within her. Mark kept his gaze fixed. "Why, Sarah? Why did you do this? What did you try to hide from me?" He tried to remain calm, but his voice was shaking. Every fiber of her being yearned for an explanation, something that could somehow justify the chaos she brought into their lives. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "When I met Donovan, he involved me in something I never should have participated in. He knew I needed to keep my job, he knew our financial situation. I was in debt, Mark. Debts that I never told you about, because I was ashamed. And Donovan promised me a way out. I never thought things would come to this." Mark felt the anger rising again. "So you decided to commit crimes? Have you decided to betray our marriage?" Sarah lowered her head, eyes fixed on the floor. "It was more than that. I didn't just betray you. I betrayed myself. I let him manipulate me, let him convince me that everything was okay, that it was just temporary. But then things got out of control. When I realized, I was already involved up to my neck. You had a choice, Sarah. You always had a choice." The words came out of Mark like a sentence. And he believed it. No matter what she said, he couldn't understand how anyone could let themselves get involved in something so dangerous, something that had not only ruined their marriage but could now land her in prison for many years. She approached the glass that separated them, her eyes red from crying. "Mark, listen to me. I know nothing will change what I did. I know you will never forgive me. But you need to know. I never meant to harm you. I wanted to make things right, I swear. And that's why I went to Donovan. I thought that if I did what he wanted, he would let me out of this life, this nightmare. And now you're trapped, Sarah. That's what he gave you." Mark's words were cutting, and he saw her face contort in pain as she heard them. But he didn't feel sorry. I couldn't. All he saw was a woman who destroyed what they had through selfish choices. A woman who, in an attempt to protect herself, threw away years of love and trust. Sarah put her hands on her head, trying to hold back the tears. "I can't change what I did, Mark. I know that. But, please don't hate me. I know it's too much to ask. But I need to believe that you, at least, understand that. I didn't want it to end like this. I just wanted a better life." Mark looked at her one last time, and in his eyes there was a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Acceptance that it was all over, that the love they shared was destroyed by lies and greed and bad choices. And then he stood up, eyes still locked on hers, before turning and leaving the room, without saying another word. As he walked out of prison, Mark felt like he was leaving behind not just Sarah, but a lifetime of broken dreams. And even though part of him still wanted to understand, still wanted to forgive, he knew that some things could never be fixed. And that certain betrayals are like deep wounds, they can heal, but the scars will always be there, reminding us of a past that could never be erased. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and made a decision: he needed to move on. And to do that, I would have to leave all that suffering, those memories, behind. After the prison visit, Mark's life began to change irreversibly. The next few months were dedicated to letting go of everything that connected him to Sarah. He sold the apartment, got rid of the furniture and even some clothes she had bought for him. The city, which once seemed like a place full of possibilities, was now just a scenery that he needed to leave behind. For Mark, every corner brought back a painful memory, every noise echoed moments spent with a woman he now barely recognized. The decision to leave everything behind came naturally. With the money from the sale of the apartment and the division of assets after the divorce, he left for another city, a new beginning, a new life. It was difficult, painful, but also liberating. Little by little, he rediscovered himself, finding a new meaning for himself away from the shadows of Sarah's betrayal and crimes. He began working as a freelance consultant, making room for a simpler life, without the pressures and expectations of a grand career or a perfect relationship. For him, what mattered now was peace. Loneliness was ultimately his only companion, but one he chose to accept. But Sarah's story did not find such a serene end. Investigations into the financial fraud case intensified, and new information came to light. Her connection to Donovan was deeper than anyone knew, and his criminal involvement was greater than anyone could imagine. The courtrooms were packed with lawyers, prosecutors and reporters, all interested in every sordid detail of the case. Sarah tried to argue that she had been coerced, forced to be part of the scheme, but the evidence was too incriminating, and her confession only counted against her. The charming smile that once opened doors was now not enough to convince them of his innocence. The trial was long and exhausting. Mark only attended court once, just to hear the verdict, but he couldn't stay until the end. Seeing her there, sitting in the dock, looking lost and distant, he felt a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for what she had become, but relief at finally being free from that situation. Sarah was sentenced to years in prison for financial fraud, money laundering and participation in a criminal organization. The sentence was harsh, and as the judge read each point, she just nodded, as if finally accepting the consequences of her choices. Donovan, the boss and lover, tried to escape when he realized that his criminal network was about to be discovered. But justice caught up with him. He was arrested when he tried to leave the country using a false identity, carrying a suitcase full of cash. The image of him being captured by the police, his arrogant face now filled with despair, graced all the covers of newspapers and magazines. In court, he tried to shift all the blame onto Sarah, but prosecutors were well prepared and showed that he was, in fact, the mastermind behind the entire criminal scheme. Donovan received an even harsher sentence than Sarah's. And his public image was destroyed forever, with no chance of rehabilitation. The years passed, and Sarah served her sentence in silence. The glow that once enchanted everyone around him disappeared, giving way to an empty, tired expression. She lost friends, family, reputation, everything. Yet perhaps the worst punishment for Sarah was the fact that despite everything, she continued to think about Mark, continued to wonder what her life would have been like if she had made other decisions. She wrote letters to him during her time in prison, letters to which he never responded. But she needed to believe that, somehow, he read them. She needed to believe that he, somewhere in her new life, forgave her. Even if that forgiveness was never said in words. And for Mark, forgiveness was something he worked on himself for a long time. He needed to forgive himself for not having seen it before, for having been deceived, for having placed all his trust and love in someone who betrayed him. And in the end, he succeeded. He looked back with gratitude for the good times, but also with acceptance that sometimes people make mistakes, and they make irremediable mistakes. In his new life, he found love again, but this time, a love that came slowly, without the fervent passion of the beginning, but with a serenity that he learned to value. The last news he heard from Sarah was that she had been released from prison after serving part of her sentence for good behavior. He received this information with indifference, like a distant memory of something that was no longer part of his life. Mark moved on, and Sarah had to face the consequences of her actions alone, knowing that no matter how hard she tried to rebuild her life, the past would always follow her, like a shadow that would never completely disappear. And so, each one followed a different path, carrying the scars of a story that began with love, turned into betrayal and ended in justice. Mark found peace in the simplicity of a new life. Sarah encountered the weight of her choices and the need to rebuild herself from the ruins. And Donovan was forgotten, like so many other criminals who tried to live above the law, but in the end, ended up right where they belonged. If you made it this far, leave in the comments what you thought of this impactful story. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to the channel to hear more stories full of emotion, dilemmas and twists like this one. Remember, we do not support cheating of any kind here. The stories are fictional, but the moral is real: betrayal destroys lives, and wrong choices always have consequences. Until the next story.